What's up guys, welcome back to Fancy Goldfish Fanatics. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive on my dream reef tank, so make sure you stay tuned to find out more. Hey Fanatics family, welcome back. As always, check out our links in the description and make sure to check out our sponsors, Star Fisheries and Jimmy Goldfish. Today we are going to be doing a deep dive on my dream reef tank. We're going to be looking at every single part of the tank. I'm going to be going into heavy detail on everything to do with the tank, from the stock, the rock, the filtration, the maintenance, everything about it, because I've had quite a few people asking me lots of different questions about it, and I thought it would be best to just do one big video highlighting everything about the tank. I've actually in fact had a lot of, well, not a lot of people, but I've had quite a few people saying that this tank would not work at all and I was stupid for even trying this, and I just want to prove those people wrong. And we'll probably do a few updates in maybe a couple of months time on it, but I'm going to head over to the tank now. We're going to take a real close look at it and talk all about it, so I will catch you in a minute.
One eternity later.
So first of all, let's talk about the size of the tank. So this tank was custom made by ND Aquatics. It is 8 feet long, it is 3 feet front to back, and it is 2.5 feet tall, just over 2.5 foot tall. And it holds approximately 1,600 litres of water. Now, as it is a marine tank, it has salt water, so I used a filtered tap water. I didn't use RODI, and there was quite a few reasons to that. First of all, I didn't have anywhere to store that amount of water, so I'd have had to have the RODI unit hooked up all of the time, and it would have taken quite a few weeks on my unit to do, with it constantly being plugged into the shower, and it would have just been such an inconvenience. So what I did, instead of doing that, I took a risk and I decided to filter the tap water instead. I still ran the water through my RODI unit, however, I didn't have the wastewater running into a drain. I actually had the wastewater running into the tank. Now, many of you will say, well, that is a completely stupid idea and completely ridiculous, and maybe I would have agreed with you in the beginning, but clearly I have not had any problems and it was worth it so far. What I did was, firstly, I had a 5 micron filter membrane, then I had 2 cartridges of fresh activated carbon, then I had the DI membrane, and then finally I had a cartridge plumbed into the system which contained DI resin. Then after this, once the water was added to the tank, I had around half to a kilo of activated carbon in the system, whilst there was no livestock in there to soak up anything within the water. Now obviously this activated carbon would have removed lots of impurities, lots of chlorine, chloramine, and the DI resin would have helped as well. I definitely would have said, after I filled this tank up, all of those units were basically trash. All of the carbon was completely exhausted, the DI resin was rubbish, but I managed to fill this tank up in, I believe, 3 days on a real slow trickle, instead of probably 3 weeks, if not longer, if I was actually using my RODI unit properly and I had it going to waste. So that is the size of the tank and how I filled it up. Next, I used just under 2 buckets of the Red Sea Coral Pro sea salt. Now, I went for this sea salt because it has high levels of calcium, magnesium, KH, etc. and it has lots of those slightly elevated trace elements as well, which I thought would be a good start when I started to add corals to the system. So that is the water highlighted. Next, let's talk a little bit about the substrate. As this video goes on, you will see I have done things very, very unconventionally, and I've really tried to bend the rules, and so far I'm quite blown away with how successful it's been, but obviously time will be a factor and we will have to see how this tank does long term. So let's start off with the substrate. As you can see, Differently to most marine tanks, we have a black substrate, and this is not a aragonite or coral substrate. This is actually just a black tropical sand. It has no buffering or pH factors on the water, and it has not got any influencing factors on the hardness or the KH, for example, which a normal aragonite or coral substrate would. I believe this is just a black sand that is used just for general tropical tanks. I was a little bit worried because after doing quite a lot of research, black sands can have quite high metal content and a large number of metal sort of filings, metal pieces. After doing quite a bit of research, I decided I'd like to take the risk on this, and people said it can vary on batch to batch. I haven't found too much sort of metal in this substrate, and obviously metal long term can be a real detrimental impact to the reef, but I wanted to take that risk because I thought the black substrate, along with the sort of black tape, the black background, the black lights, everything like that, I thought it would create quite a nice effect and the corals would really pop in colour. And so far it has done just that. Next, let's move on to the rock. So I started off with all dry rock. I didn't want the risk of lots of pests coming into the tank like bristleworms, crabs, snails, mantis shrimp, anything like that. My first marine tank, I did start with live rock, and I did have quite a lot of pests that actually ate my corals, and I didn't want to do that again. And also I wanted to try something a bit different, expand my knowledge, and start with all dry rock just to see how the tank would do long term. So there is around 200 kilos of dry rock within this tank. It might be a little bit deceptive on video, but this tank is 3 foot deep, so we do have a huge amount of rock. So we have, I didn't mention it, but we have around 80 kilos of sand and around 200 kilos of rock, maybe slightly more. So now we've covered the size, the substrate, and the rock. Next, let's move on a little bit to the equipment. So as you'll also notice, hopefully you can see that on the camera shot, I've got two Hydra 26 HDs in black with the black brackets. Now, this tank generally, as a normal reefer, should have 4, 5, 6 of those lights above it to create enough par and enough spread of lighting to illuminate the tank and provide the corals with enough light. However, this is a budget tank and this is a low energy tank as well, so I've actually only gone for 2 lights because I really wanted to see how it would perform. A lot of reefers have a huge amount of lighting on their systems, and I really wanted to try something different, bend the rules again, and see if the corals would survive, grow or thrive under this lighting, because this amount of lighting is generally what you'd use on a standard 4x2x2 tank, which is probably around 6 times smaller than this system. But so far so good. I believe we're around 4 months into the build, maybe edging on 5 months, and the system's done really well. I've had significant growth on multiple corals. I haven't lost any corals yet. I have had one that bleached a little bit, that was in sort of the shaded areas or the shadows, but that's generally what would happen if it didn't have too much light. But on the most part, the corals have really grown very well, and I'm really surprised with how well it's done. So those lights are running near 100%. I don't run any whites whatsoever, and I think that's what's attributed to the lack of algae growth and the lack of dirty stage, so you can say you would generally normally have on a reef tank. Touch wood, I only had a diatom stage, which is where the rocks and sand gets covered in brown algae, and at touch wood I haven't had any hair algae appear whatsoever, and the rocks have stayed relatively clean. So now we've covered the lighting, let's talk about flow. Generally on marine tanks, people have or spend a lot of money on flow, because flow is really important in providing the reef with lots of oxygen, moving the CO2 out of the system, and providing the corals with food and essential nutrients. So for flow, instead of going for something expensive like the Ecotech MP40s, MP60s, or maybe the AI Neros or something like that, I've actually chosen to go for a really cheap wave maker, potentially one of the cheapest wave makers on the market. So back behind the rocks over in the right hand corner, you can't actually see them because they're really well hidden. I have two wave makers. Each one is 12,000 litres per hour. So I've got a 24,000 litres per hour output from those two wave makers. And then above that I have a J-Cod RW4, which provides, I believe, around 4,000 litres on top of that. Now, the reason I went for these wave makers is because, one, they were very cheap. I think they're around £30 for the pair. I managed to get them in a sort of Black Friday kind of deal, and they so far have been really reliable. They only have one speed, which is on, compared to a lot of wave makers which have different variable settings. However, I have the J-Cod at the top on a variable random flow, and also I have this wired up to a battery backup in case there are any power outages. At least I can get a little bit of flow around the tank to give me a little bit more time if there are any outages and I need to do something to the tank. So I have around 28,000 litres per hour of flow throughout the tank, which has done really well. The corals seem to like it. I've had no corals that are really unhappy, etc. And so far it's been really good and it has worked really well. I definitely wouldn't want to have any less flow in this tank, and I think it potentially could do with a little bit more, but so far so good. Those wave makers also are 24 watts each, which is really good for the size they are compared to a lot of the wave makers on the market, which were a lot more wattage for a lot less output. So now we have covered the flow and the lighting, let's talk a little bit about filtration. Now, as you can see, this tank is on the floor. There is no stand with a sump or canister filters underneath, and hopefully you can see either side there are no filters either. So a lot of you may be thinking, where on earth are your filters on this tank? For such a huge tank, the clarity is very good. Where are the filters? So let's head round the side of the tank and take a closer look at the filtration system.
A few moments later.
Sorry about the tight squeeze we have here. I do have a very big ficus plant which is in the way of most of the shot, but hopefully you can see what's going on. So essentially for the filtration, I have a large box that I have built in the back of the tank, which is built from black acrylic. Now I used 8mm acrylic, which didn't warp too much, and it provides a really strong holding for the rocks in the front. Although the rocks aren't really leaning and causing too much pressure on them, they provide a nice barrier between that and the filter. Now, many people would run lots of biomedia, a large skimmer, reactors, lots of different things in their filter, lots of chemical filtration. However, for me, I just have the weirs at the top. The water flows down into some filter floss, which captures the majority of the physical waste. Then I also run a poly filter to remove any contaminants, as I did not use pure RO water and I do have this black tropical sand. I don't want to take too many risks, so I do run poly filters in the tank to remove any contaminants that may be coming out of the sand or any in the water. However, I've changed the poly filters around twice so far, and I've noticed that they don't discolor, so it's clear to me there are no high levels of metal within the water like aluminium, copper or anything like that. The water then travels down through a sheet of filter foam. This gives the filter fleece a little bit of rigidity so that it can lie flat on top. I also have a bit of egg crate which separates the mechanical filtration from the refugium down below. Now, as you'll see, the refugium is lit by this 20-watt floodlight which just attaches onto my plant, and then the water travels down into the refugium here. Now, the refugium is made up of two different macroalgae species. One is Colerpra prolifera, I believe, and the other one is Colerpra racemosa, I believe. So I've got two different types of Colerpra, and they're growing really, really well. Now, as you'll notice, because the filtration is not huge, and I do have a few fish in the tank, these macroalgae reduce the nitrates and the phosphates and any other organic waste from the water and reduce them down. So we have the poly filter for removing any metals or any toxic substances within the water. We have our mechanical filtration, which is the filter fleece. And then finally, we have the algae, which removes those phosphates and nitrates. I also run a bag of carbon, around 500 grams, which I change out every 4 weeks, as this helps to remove any pheromones, hormones, any build-up of other organic waste that the other filtration methods do not remove from the water. So that is essentially the entire section of the filter. Now, generally, a normal tank would return the water from the filter back to the display with a return pump, maybe a J-Cod variable speed pump or similar. However, you may notice down in the corner I have an air pump. Now, this air pump provides the flow back into the main tank. Now, a lot of you may not have watched my video that I did on airlifts, but essentially, to keep it nice and simple, 30 litres of air per minute is pumped from that air pump into a pipe. As the air rushes to the top, it pulls water with it and then returns that back to the top of the tank. Now, not only does this return the water, but it also has a multitude of other benefits. As the air returns to the tank, it creates bubbles at the surface of that pipe. Those bubbles then form into a skimmate, similar to a normal skimmer that you would run on a reef tank, and that skimmate is collected into a jug. Also, using a large amount of air means I can pump lots of oxygen into the tank. It means that the water can be degassed of CO2 as well. Also, the air pump is nice and cheap to replace. I think that one cost me around £40, and to get a replacement it's around £40 to £50. So nice and cheap, and quite significantly cheaper than the equivalent water pump. Also, it is low wattage and it is easy for me to change out. There are no moving parts within the water. The pump is situated out of the water, so an install of a new pump takes less than a minute. Super simple, super easy. Also, I find that as the air pumps age, rather than breaking fully and just stopping, they generally just slow down with the air production, and you can sort of see when the air pump is coming to the end of its life. So many benefits there. The water is returned from the base of the filter back into the main tank. So essentially that is how the tank is filtered. Next, let's head off back to the front of the tank and let's talk a little bit about water management and dosing. So as you can see, there are a multitude of corals in the tank, and we'll talk a little bit more about them as the video goes on. I wanted to talk about dosing elements because as the corals grow, they use different elements within the water like carbonates, magnesium, calcium, and many other macro and micro elements as well. So I wanted a really simple solution where I didn't need an additional dosing pump, something that consumes electricity, that's also expensive, and that runs multiple different elements. So that is why I chose to try the TMC or Tropic Marine All for Reef. Now, the All for Reef is a powder that you can just add to the tank. Once you have your elements at the correct level, then you can just add this powder and it provides everything that your corals need into the system. So far this has been going really well, and I don't actually need to dose too much of it, although I do have a huge amount of corals and I believe this may change as the tank goes along. I'm not that naive in thinking that I may need to add a dose in the future, but so far this has been really cost effective and really efficient to dose. So that is the elements that I am adding to the tank, and that is all I add apart from the fish food. So I just add the Tropic Marine All for Reef, and then I feed the fish with different frozen foods. So going on to frozen foods and what I feed the tank. I feed the tank a multitude of different frozen foods like red plankton, mysis, krill, brine shrimp, mussels, lobster eggs, I believe, and there are probably a few more that I've missed out. And that is all I add. I don't add any amino acids, I don't add any additives, any coral foods, anything like that. And I just purely add the frozen food and the Tropic Marine All for Reef. So you may also be thinking, well, what about evaporation? Generally on really large tanks, you would go through a huge amount of RO water due to evaporation. And you'll potentially notice that this tank is fully lidded, and I have it fully lidded for a couple of reasons. First, it stops any of the wrasse, which are the inhabitants within the tank, from jumping out. Also, it stops anything from falling in the tank and eliminates any dust, any physical waste or any contaminants from entering the system. I do have the 30 litres per minute of air which pumps into the system, and that air escapes through the gaps in the lids and also the skimmer as well. Because of that, I have real minimal water loss. I would say on average I probably lose about 5 litres of water through evaporation per month on this tank. Generally, I'm finding I'm topping up this tank with around 5 to 10 litres of RO water every 4 to 6 weeks, and over that time period the salinity isn't even changing that much at all. Generally the tank stays between 1.025 and 1.026 specific gravity, and it's really nice because it really reduces my maintenance and my care on the tank. So before we start to speak about the inhabitants, I thought I would take you through the maintenance regime that I have on this tank. And this is probably something that is very different to the majority of tanks out there, and something that you may not be expecting from this tank as well. Generally on large tanks you will need to do very large water changes to prevent physical waste buildup, prevent contamination from the organics that are being produced by the food that enters the system, and also with cleaning the substrate, cleaning the glass, etc., and just replenishing the minerals. Now, because I dose the Tropic Marine Alpha Reef and add those elements back to the system, I'm not needing to replenish those elements through water changes. Now, a lot of viewers may disagree with that, and I can totally understand that. Replacing minerals and elements in the water with water changes is very good, and I do advocate the use of water changes, but I am trying to bend the rules a little bit and try something new. As you can see with the setup being on the floor, the different type of filtration method, running no sump, no auto top up, and not having a doser, I'm trying to keep bending those rules in my maintenance regime. So I actually don't do any water changes on this tank either, which really reduces the maintenance and really lets me enjoy this tank for what it is. Now, I do occasionally, every 4 to 6 weeks, probably do 2 barrels of water, and what I would do is I would siphon all of the substrate, removing any physical waste, and I'm purely doing this to remove physical contamination from the tank, not to replace any elements. Now, when I do those water changes, I do use RO water rather than filtered tap water, as I believe over the years that I keep this tank, as the water comes out and pure 0 TDS water goes in, I will be reducing and diluting anything that's in the system that could potentially be harmful to the fish and corals, although so far it's been really successful. So when I do those 2 barrels, that is approximately 50 litres of water changed, and I believe that is around a 3% water change, and I just do that every 4 to 6 weeks, as I mentioned. It takes me about 10 to 15 minutes, nice and simple. I don't want to be lugging lots of water around the house, pumping lots of water everywhere, and also water changes on a tank this size can be very costly indeed. So that essentially is the water regime. I change the filter floss out in the filter every 1 to 1.5 weeks, as that tends to go brown quite quickly with all the physical waste that it traps. So essentially for maintenance, I do no water changes. My weekly maintenance is purely cleaning the glass once, but the glass normally gets dirty every 1 to 1.5 weeks. Takes around 5 to 10 minutes to clean, change out the filter floss and feed the fish. So essentially that is the only maintenance I do on this tank, and funnily enough, this is probably one of the lowest maintenance tanks that I've ever kept. Surprisingly, when you look at it, you think it would be very high maintenance, but I would say on an average week, I spend around 15 to 20 minutes looking after the tank, and I actually enjoy the maintenance. It's nice and easy, don't really need to get my hands wet. The only thing that I do that probably takes quite a bit of time is moving the corals around, making sure I'm happy with the placement, but that is more of an enjoyable task. So now we have covered the whole system. We've covered the equipment, the maintenance, the size, the filtration. Let's talk about the stocking and what's actually within the tank. If you've got any questions so far, please leave a comment down below as well, and I'll do my best to answer that and help you explain a little bit more about the system if you have any comments or queries about it. So let's talk about what is within the system. Now, here is one of the things which I believe benefits the system and won't lead to the downfall long term. I believe if I had some large fish like tangs, triggers, angels, puffers, any large fish in the system, then I would definitely run into some problems with high nutrients, the rocks would get really dirty. I may get an imbalance of nutrients leading to cyano, maybe a bacterial bloom, etc. But I only keep this tank stocked with very small fish, and you'll see the wrasse that are swimming around throughout the video. Now currently there are 12 wrasse within the tank, and I'm probably going to bump that up to around 20 fish in total. I believe having the smaller fish is where the tank thrives, and it doesn't lead to too much waste build-up. These fish are very small, and I would say having around 20 wrasse in the tank is probably the equivalent to having around 5 or 6 large tanks, and 5 or 6 large tanks in 1600 litres isn't going to be too problematic long term. Having these wrasse means I only have to feed them currently once to twice a day, not adding too much frozen food, which leads to the refugium in the filtration system being able to cope with that nutrient input. I would say my nitrates are around the 20 range, and my phosphate is around 0.2 to 0.25. I would like to get those levels down a little bit. Ideally, I want my nitrates to be sitting around 10 parts per million, and the phosphate to be sitting around 0.1 to 0.05. They are the numbers that I'd like to get to, and I won't be adding any more fish or livestock until my refugium has caught up, grown large enough, and is able to manage that waste. So we've got those 12 wrasse in the tank. There are many different species. I've got a radiant wrasse, I have a twisty, I have a yellowtail, I have a Timor wrasse, I have a banana wrasse. What else have we got? We've got the McCosker's flasher wrasse. I also have a Mauritius jeweled leopard wrasse. I've got a candy cane hog, and I have a male and female pair of peacock wrasse. I also have a male and female pair of some deep water Bathyspilus wrasse, which I believe are a type of Sahilabus wrasse. Hopefully I'm not messing up too much on the punctuation there, or the pronunciation I should say. And I believe that is all I've got. As for invertebrates, I've got a multitude of turbo snails, trocus snails, Nasaria snails, some conches. I have a couple of sea urchins, and you may notice there are a couple of sea urchins that have some little 3D printed hats on them, which is quite funny because they look really unique, and also it allows me to see where they are in the system as well. I also have a porcelain crab, and I think there's a few other critters like the shrimps, cleaner shrimps, peppermint shrimps, and fire shrimps. I will obviously be adding to this list. I'm letting the tank slowly establish before adding anything new. I believe the last time I added anything to this tank was around the 6 week ago mark, and I potentially will be adding some new fish probably in the next 4 weeks, giving it a little bit more time to mature, the bacteria levels to build up, the level of cleanup crew to handle all the current waste, and the refugium to catch up as well. So we have covered the invertebrates and the fish. Next on to is the corals. Now I probably have been overlaying a little bit of stock footage that I've taken, or a friend has taken on his phone, which provides some really clear shots of the corals to really allow you to see them, and the way the tank has been set up as well. So now let's focus a little bit on the corals. As you can see, there are a multitude of corals throughout this tank. We have LPS, which stands for large polyp stony corals, like the hammer coral here. We have the torch coral. We have a few more hammers down here. We have a Cyphastria, some chalice. We also have many different soft corals, like the red mushrooms, the green soft corals, the clavularia, clove polyps, some more mushrooms, zoas, palithoa, Kenya trees, and the list really goes on. As you can see, throughout the entire tank, we have a huge range of corals and an absolutely massive stocking list. It would probably take me an hour, if not a couple of hours, to name all of the corals that we have in the system. But so far, as I mentioned, the corals are doing really well, and I'm really happy with the way they are thriving and growing, and they're definitely doing really well, and this tank is doing really well, and I'm really happy with it. Now, I wouldn't say this is the way you would normally run a tank, running it on an airlift with no water changes, with minimal lighting, minimal equipment, and really sort of skimping out on it. I would say this is definitely not the best way to run a tank. However, so far it is working for me, and it's really going to be the test of time, seeing if this tank runs well long term. I would say if I can get to the 12-month mark with no problems or issues, I think this tank will run really well long term, providing I keep up with that 4 to 6 weeks cleaning the sand bed, removing any detritus and physical waste, keeping it nicely turned over as well. I think in the future I want to add, as I said, some more fish. I also want to add a few more bits of cleanup crew. In the long term, I'd like to add some NPS corals here, which stand for non-photosynthetic, because that is a shaded area of the tank, and I think it would look really nice with some gorgonians, some chili corals, and some other NPS corals as well. I also would like to add a few starfish, some sand sniffing starfish, a few different cucumbers, and just a few other different inverts like a boxing shrimp, for example. I think over the next 6 months this tank is really going to come to life. I'm really happy with the way it has set up and is thriving so far, but I think over the next 6 months, once I can get all of the 20 wrasse in, I can get some more corals in, some more inverts, I think it's really going to start coming to life and really get to a really nice impressive state if it can keep going on the journey that it currently is going. So that is everything on the tank. I think I've covered everything. Also, it gets quite a lot of natural sunlight, which I think is a real positive to the corals and really helps them to thrive. Obviously, I haven't gone through a summer yet with this tank, but I believe the summer sun is really going to help these corals to grow and really establish within the tank. So pretty much that is the whole summary on this tank. I've gone through the stocking, the setup, the maintenance, the filtration, the equipment, and I believe I've covered everything about this system. As I said, if you do have any questions on my tank, or you've got any queries, or maybe even if you've got some improvements or suggestions on things I could change, I'm all ears. As I said, this is a low budget, low maintenance tank. I believe it costs around £20 to £30 in electricity to run per month, and then around £5 in frozen food. So really keeping it under £40 a month is doing really well, and I'm really happy with the way it's going so far. But as I said, if you do have any questions or queries, please leave a comment down below. And also, if you enjoyed this video, let me know as well. I thought it'd be nice to have this video explaining the entire setup of this tank and just the way it runs overall. So that is it for this video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. As always, thank you for watching. Remember to keep those water changes up, and happy fish keeping.